Someone asked me to explain Revelation 20, and to be honest, the millennium is one of the most misunderstood themes in the Bible. But once you understand the structure, suddenly everything starts to fall into place. So what is that structure? In the Bible, prophecy repeats and it expands, and Revelation 20 is the perfect example of this. The events are not in strictly chronological order, but rather we have 4 repeating prophetic cycles, each one covering the same general end-time events, but from a slightly different focus. The first cycle focuses on Satan and the state of the earth. The second cycle focuses on the righteous in heaven. The third cycle looks at the wicked being judged. And the fourth cycle focuses on life in the New Jerusalem. When we understand these repeating cycles, we can make sense of why it is that the lake of fire is mentioned on 3 different occasions. It's not because there are 3 different judgments, but rather it's the same event that takes place at the end of 3 cycles. It also explains why in verse 9, the wicked surround the city before they're destroyed, while later in the chapter it appears like they've been destroyed before the city has come down. These apparent contradictions all disappear when you understand where each cycle begins and ends. And as for the timing of the millennium, Revelation 20 follows on directly from Revelation 19, where the second coming is described. Now with that aside, let's walk through the 4 cycles. So the first cycle focuses on Satan and the state of the earth after Christ comes. In verse 1, Satan is bound, and in verse 2, he's cast into the bottomless pit. But what is the bottomless pit? In the Greek, it's the word avisos, which is the same word used in the Septuagint in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 2 to describe the state of the preformed world. We read there, darkness was on the face of the avisos, the deep. So why is this relevant? It tells us that Satan will be bound to a world that has been returned to its lifeless, formless condition that it had in Genesis 1 and verse 2, a condition that will be brought about by the plagues and the second coming. And Jeremiah 4 confirms this. We read there, I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void. Does that sound familiar? The heavens, and they had no light. There was no man. Pay attention to that. And all the cities were broken down at the presence of the Lord. That is the condition of the earth during the 1,000 years. So for those who think that Jesus is going to come back and set up a temporal kingdom on earth with the saints, you might need to think again. During this time, the earth will be desolate. There will be no man, and Satan will be bound to this desolate, dark wilderness for 1,000 years with no one to tempt or deceive. But, as verse 3 tells us, he will be released for a little season at the end of the millennium, where he will once again go about deceiving the nations. And this ends the first cycle. Now we move into our second cycle, but first we need to rewind back to the start of the millennium. And this time the shift focuses to the righteous in heaven. In verse 4, John sees thrones set up and judgment being given to the saints. And verses 5 and 6 tell us that these are those who took part in the first resurrection, a phrase that implies there must also be a second resurrection that we'll get to a bit later. Now we know that the first resurrection takes place at the second coming because it's then that the righteous dead are raised while the living are changed to immortality, and together they meet the Lord in the air. They then return with him to heaven, where Christ has prepared mansions for them, and they live and reign with him for 1,000 years. During this time, judgment is given to the saints, and Paul confirms this in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verses 2 and 3, where he says, Do ye not know that the saints shall judge the world? Know ye not that we shall judge angels? And while the righteous are judging, we're told in verse 5 that the wicked remain dead. The rest of the dead live not again until the 1,000 years were finished. The wicked are killed either by the plagues or by the second coming of Christ. In Revelation 19 and verse 21, we read, And the remnant, this is those who were not killed by plagues, were slain with the sword of him that sat upon the horse, which is Christ. Jeremiah 25 and verse 33 speaks of the same event, and he says, The slain of the Lord shall be at that day from one end of the earth even unto the other. They shall not be lamented, neither gathered nor buried. They shall be dung upon the ground. So why is no one lamenting, gathering, or burying them? It's because the wicked are all dead and the righteous are all in heaven. There's no one alive upon the earth except for Satan and the fallen angels. And now we come to verse 7, where we're told that at the end of the millennium, Satan will be released. And this coincides with the resurrection of the wicked. And in verse 8, we see that Satan once more returns to his work of deception. He gathers the saints together and leads them to attack the holy city. But then fire comes down from God out of heaven and destroys them. And in verse 10, we get our very first mention of the lake of fire. And this also concludes our second cycle. And now we come to our third cycle. And once again, we need to rewind back to the second coming. And we know this because in verse 11, we read this. And I saw a great white throne and him that sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away. Now this mirrors the same language that we see in Revelation 6, verses 14 through 16, which speaks of the second coming of Christ. It says there, the heavens departed as a scroll, which is to say they fled. Every mountain and island were moved because they fled. And the wicked cried out for the rocks to fall on us and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne. So both passages speak of the heavens and the earth fleeing from the one that sits upon the throne. Now after this, in verse 12, we see the wicked standing before God. But we've already read in verse 5 that they aren't resurrected until the end of the millennium, and verse 4 tells us that the judgment takes place during the millennium. So what we're seeing here is not a physical courtroom scene. The wicked are not there in person, but rather their books are opened and they are judged out of those things written in the books. Then after this, in verse 13, we see the resurrection of the wicked, and we read, the sea gave up the dead which were in it. This is when the wicked are physically raised. They then receive the verdict of their judgment and are cast into the lake of fire. And this is the second mention now that we have of the lake of fire. And this cycle then finishes in Revelation 21 and verse 1 with the creation of the new heavens and the new earth. And there ends our third cycle, and now we come into our fourth and final cycle. And this cycle's a little different. Unlike the others that take us back to the second coming, this one focuses on the post-millennium events. It starts with the descent of the New Jerusalem to the earth and finishes in verse 8 with the destruction of the wicked. We read there, the fearful and unbelieving shall have their part in the lake of fire, which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. This here is the third and final reference to the lake of fire, and now we have the whole picture. So as you can see, Revelation 20 isn't a strict timeline of events, but rather we have 4 repeating prophetic cycles. And when we layer them and we compare one with the next, it gives us a complete picture of what takes place from the time of the second coming to the time that the earth is made new. So if you found this information helpful, please share it with others and make sure you follow us at thefinalcrisis.info if you want to learn more keys of prophecy.